Yes, thank you for having me. Um, so what I thought, and I'll share my screen here.
I have
Um,
to ask about your background. What's going on there?
oh yeah, so, I am sitting in the new Ford Bronco. So this is all the rage in the U.S. This is the hot new off-road vehicle of the year.
Amazing. I love it. I love it.
Give me a moment. I'm just trying to fight with the obligatory share your screen. All right, so I thought if everyone would be all right, I thought what I would do is I talk about what I refer to as the data pipelines little gems, and so we'll cover a lot of I think things that will really interest this group. Um, these are a lot of the things that we work on that I don't know that everyone knows that we support, but they're just immensely powerful tools that can solve a lot of different problems in the data pipeline. And so I thought I would just call out these items, and then I imagine that this will take me at least 2/3 of the way through my time, and then at which point I'm happy to answer any questions and talk about any other topics anyone wants. But if that's all right, first topic I wanted to talk about, if I can get it to go here, is Webhook. So one of the things that we had created, I think this feature now is about 2.5 years old, is Webhook. And this is really based on the notion that we've seen a lot more systems support this. So what is Webhook? Well, Webhook is a kind of a standard across the web, although standard in the sense like REST is a standard, meaning that the payload on the webhook can vary, although it's usually JSON. And a lot more systems have embraced this as a standard to where, for like example, if it's a CRM system and that CRM system has a bunch of records that have been updated, rather than you run a connector that connects to that CRM system, if that system supports webhooks, when records update, it triggers an event and it'll push that record into Domo. And then we'll micro batch those records and update your data set. So this is a really effective tool for a lot of systems now that have records that'll update arbitrarily. So when you may not have the best strategy for like, how do I get the delta if the API doesn't support that? Well, if the system supports webhook, we support a generic webhook that will basically parse the JSON payload that comes in. And we'll talk a little bit more about it later. We have our third-party connector ID. We do have the ability for you to write your own webhook connector if you need it. So for example, and I don't know why it might be this way, but let's just say it puts a CSV payload onto the webhook. Well, then you could write a custom parser using our connector ID, and that's another great feature of Webhook. And so what I'll do is I'll just, I'll do questions at the end, but I'll just pause briefly and maybe take one at the end of each of these. So any questions or comments on Webhook?
Where would I have seen it before? I think I know what a webhook is, but have I seen it or encountered it in real life already?
More than likely. This is probably I see this common in two areas. So I see this common with some ERP systems. So like example, PeopleSoft definitely has mechanisms that fire on this type of device. I also see this very common in business to business email marketing systems. So where you're often updating contacts and records. And so they'll often provide that as a service as well.
So, guys, if you've heard of Zapier or if this, then that, I believe those are also kind of built on webhook style frameworks as well. And so Domo is just giving us a way to collect that data. And so is this like a secret way into building like an IoT kind of thing? Does it have upstart support or?
Yeah, so I think those are all great questions. So this is also very popular with IoT. So when individuals come to me, we'll vet out a couple different technologies. You'll see kind of in my slide deck that I'm not hiding that we'll talk about MQTT. So when you come to me with an IoT problem, quite often we will use webhooks as a way of managing those because you have a variety of devices that will post a large amount of messages, and Webhook is great for that. Our Webhook connector does support things like upsert, although generally speaking, when someone comes to me with an IoT use case, my belief is typically what's best is, because you're looking at kind of wanting to do a data reduction strategy, is you can do the upsert, you can certainly do partitions if that makes sense as well, but almost always I recommend, you know, obviously it is a premium feature and Nihar can talk about that, but adrenaline data flows is kind of another very important component of an IoT implementation, especially with a webhook, because you're going to get a lot of messages from a lot of devices. I haven't found with the customers I work with on IoT that they very typically want to deal with the grain on a record level. I mean, that's just too much when it comes to IoT. But the idea that you can use an adrenaline data flow to do a data reduction and bring that into, like hour chunks, maybe 15-minute chunks, and reduce that is probably really where I think one of the most powerful features in Domo. I want to, I'll let other people judge. I want to call Webhook one of the most powerful features in Domo. Maybe that isn't for me to say.
Really? That's cool.
But when you combine that with adrenaline data flows, you have a really powerful interface for managing things that are very chatty systems.
Amazing.
So let's see, I'll go through one question as I go through each, and then I'll move on to the topic, and then I'll do a bunch at the end. So I believe Jamie asked the question, scope to have this connector handle nested JSON natively in the UI. I think that's some great feedback. We'll take, I absolutely see why you'd want to do that. The no-code connector is really powerful, as you've kind of stated below. It's one of my topics here today. And I don't see why we couldn't provide you a basic JSON flattener, because one of the things that I'm looking at is providing that JSON flattening mechanism more ubiquitously. So when we get some of these arbitrary, these connectors that have to handle arbitrary JSON, that you have more power at your fingertips to decide the flattening algorithm versus us decide it for you. And so I do think that we'll see that. Yes, and then the standard, lots of questions coming in. And yes, the standard refresh rate on this is 15 minutes. If we can help vet your use case, we're able to take that down to 5 minutes. So we'll micro batch it 5 minutes at a time. So I will definitely go through any other questions on that, but I'll kind of keep us moving as we go. All right, so this is another favorite of mine that I don't know that gets a ton of press. So I don't imagine that many people knew that, but we have an ODBC driver for Domo. And why is this an important thing? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One of the ones is that you might have an individual in your organization that is using a tool outside of Domo to do some type of analysis. Right now, a very simple example of this, although we do have a pretty awesome Excel plugin, but like example, Excel can use ODBC to make a connection and pull data into a spreadsheet. If you have some other tools, so maybe someone really has some kind of analysis tool that they use on their desktop, well, then this driver enables that user to now connect their tooling up to Domo. So all that hard work you've done, and why it's so important is I watch customers do this all the time. They've done a ton of work on bringing the data into Domo, cleansing it, doing all these amazing things with Magic ETL or data science tiles, right? And you've created effectively what is the version of truth. But there's nothing more painful than after you've done all that work, if someone else goes to the origin sources and then creates a derivative, right? And what do? And then that's lost. And you don't want to deny that internal customer the ability to do analysis, of course. But you do want them working from the same underlying context of the data. And so this is a really powerful tool for bridging Domo into areas of your company or the companies you work with where they might want to have to use some other tooling. The other case that I've seen this is also very popular for is if you have a .NET developer in your organization and they're writing code and they want to take data out of Domo. So this is obviously a very standard interface for .NET, very common. And so you just plug this in and you have the ability to, enable that person that's doing that framework work. Also, the other thing that I've seen is people who also may have external to Domo ETL processes. An ODBC connection is extremely common with those type of things. So with that in mind, that's the ODBC driver. You can install it today. It's available, and you get a free 30-day trial. And then after that, it is a paid feature, but definitely something to be aware of. So,
Andy, in terms of performance, do you see it having, is it using the same APIs, i.e. is it comparable to like exporting the data from the Java CLI, or if I'm using the Excel plugin, is there any kind of secret sauce there, or is it about the same?
So I think the short answer is it is using the same APIs that you would be using if you were directly interacting to Domo through our API architecture. However, there's a couple parts to it. Depends on how you use the driver, right? So one of the things that this driver does is it allows you to query the back end of Domo. So there is an API, we refer to it as a query endpoint. It does have some limitations on how much data it will bring back. But the other thing that this driver has, and there's a function that we coded into it, and I can share it a little bit later. I don't want to root through my documentation and paste it in, but we have the ability. So if everyone here has likely worked with our API for exporting data out of Domo, it actually has some functions you can run which will export via our dataset API, the entire dataset without querying. And so if you use that functionality for working on the large data sets, you will find that it'll be as performant as our API with those type of operations.
I'm just in my mind, there was a user in the dojo the other day who's like, I need to export multi-million row data sets from Doma. What's the best way to do it? I need to come back to them with a good answer. And I'm like, I don't know what the answer to that one is.
So there's a couple things there, and Nihar, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot, I believe that the first way would be is to use the dataset API. The other way would be to use the S3 unload feature, and I don't know if Nihar, you want to cover that.
We can also give that to Ken. Ken's going to be talking about the Java CLI on Thursday.
Sorry,
I tuned out for a minute, Andy.
So we were just mentioning that how do I get a very large data set out of Domo as fast as possible? And I may have just talked about something that's coming and not here today, but the S3 unload functionality.
Yeah, I mean, that's one option. The other one is we've done some sort of custom pipelines. There's some custom work done. Again, depends on how your data is coming in, but you can set up, maybe Ken will go through this in his talk. You can set up multiple paths, upload things in parallel. So there are ways around doing these things.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So those would probably be my two go-tos there. This I wouldn't necessarily be. This to me is more of a utility play for ubiquitous delivery of data, not necessarily for that kind of high-speed operation. There's some customization I'd want to do.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So another kind of. By the way, I was going to say, I originally titled this presentation Hidden Gems, and I'm like, well, I shouldn't call it Hidden Gems because they're available. It's just what I may be guilty of is maybe not promoting this stuff as much as I should. So it comes up a fair bit. Why don't you have a connector to blank? And we do have over 1,000 connectors. However, I can't build them all. I don't want to build them all. And so one of the things that we had come up with, and we talked about this a little bit during our webhook portion of this, is the JSON no-code connector. And so this is really based out of the idea, as we've all seen this kind of concept in the industry of no-code, that we do have a full code solution for it, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in my presentation. But there's a lot of cases for just doing no-code, and in the day and age of RESTful APIs, where most things use proper HTTP verbs, and it's just going to be a JSON payload, the JSON no-code connector is fantastic, right? Because it's going to allow me to take an endpoint, call that endpoint, and then I'm going to get back a JSON payload. And with that JSON payload, now I have the ability to walk through a flattening algorithm by graphically clicking through the results set and expanding the items and really filtering just what I want, right? Because one of the problems that you have when we have to take in JSON and arbitrarily parse it, I'm effectively, when there are JSON arrays, and then in a worst case, JSON arrays with objects that may further contain JSON arrays, you very quickly end up with a massive Cartesian product, right? And generally speaking, I haven't found where everyone said, "Oh, thanks for flattening all my JSON into a giant Cartesian product," right? It doesn't make for it doesn't. I mean, occasionally that's appropriate, but it doesn't generally make for that. And so the concept of this JSON no-code connector is the idea that you can call out to those endpoints. You can isolate the elements in the tree that you want. You can flatten that into a reasonable data set in Domo and work from there. And the idea is this is really a stopgap. So if you don't want us to build a connector for you, which, obviously we build connectors, we build them all the time. We do connector engagements. You don't exactly quote me on it, but we're building this sprint alone, I think half a dozen connectors. So it's a lot of, it's a lot of connectors that my team will support. But at the same time, I understand maybe you don't want to pay for a connector engagement. So this is then your next best go-to tool. And then if you don't feel that this is substantial enough, we'll talk about it later. You can build a custom connector. And also the opportunity where I'm hoping I'm seeing more and more ISVs build connectors. So I'm hoping that trend continues, and I'm hoping that groups like this will help champion this with their vendors to consider using our development tools for doing that. But this here is what I affectionately refer to as the Swiss Army knife. So it's the connector that can do many, many things. But certainly you wouldn't build a house with a Swiss Army knife. So in that case, we'll move into some of the more larger tools. But this has been a pretty amazing connector, and I've seen some pretty amazing success stories. Also, just one other point of note, we do provide this with OAuth support. So this is JSON no code where in the essentially the get HTTP verb get, when we call out to the system, this one will have has the ability to basically put in a header or part of the query string in the query to get the credentials in. We do have one that does an OAuth foil. The only thing I always caveat there is OAuth is a standard. However, it's not a standard that dictates every part in the process. So there's a few parts where, like, for example, for those that are familiar with it, where I exchange the code for the secret and the refresh token. That at that particular point, the payload that comes back sometimes is JSON, sometimes it's XML, sometimes it's essentially a query string that we have to parse. And so we've tried to manage many of the individual parts of it, but it's we've tried to get the majority of things, and then you would graduate out of that into some of the other developer options that we provide. So that's JSON no code, and yeah, I definitely agree. Sorry, I'm reading the post here. Yeah, and so I can appreciate that just doing JSON no code could be a whole hour-long session. And at some point, I'm always happy to set something up, and I'll bring some engineers, and we can go into that full bore. Kind of my hope here is to kind of selfishly, I'm hoping to drive interest to parts of the product that maybe aren't getting as much attention as some others. And yeah, if there's interest in going way deep dive in some of these, I can put together an hour-long presentation on everything I brought here today.
That's happening, Andy. I've got a whole YouTube channel ready for you.
Okay.
On that, a question though, if I have a person who's trying to figure out how to get started in the JSON no code, obviously the KB documentation is what it is, but is there a way to reach what's the best way to get support? Is it still through support@domo.com, or is there one specific for connectors?
It's still traditional Domo support.
Okay.
And we look at, and because one of the things that we do note, this is more of a developer tool. So we do spend a fair amount of time, similar to what we do with the connector IDE, providing kind of developer level support. Oh, here's what's kind of going on with the API. Here's why this is a problem. So we are trying to support this like a dev tool. So we do provide that feedback back.
That's amazing. Okay.
So this is kind of a fun one that we've been working on. And so this is just newly, we've had a few different iterations of this, but this is newly arrived. So I don't know who's familiar with MQTT, but this is an extremely popular technology for IoT devices. And so this is something that we've offered in a variety of formats as we've been kind of progressing the product. And so what this is if you have devices, and those devices basically will generally either communicate via webhook, which we already talked about in depth, but they may also do a protocol level type sending of the information, and that will be MQTT. So what you will generally have within your enterprise somewhere is an MQTT broker. And all of these devices, and by the way, Amazon, a great partner of ours, they provide this type of service through their IoT core services. And so all these devices will open up a socket connection. So the idea behind this is this is for very chatty devices that don't want to deal with the overhead of the HTTP protocol. So this makes a protocol level connection to your MQTT provider, or a broker, I meant to say. And one example of this would be Amazon AWS IoT Core. And these messages get put on that bus. And then we have our MQTT subscriber here. And we have a couple different ways this works. And when you work with us, we'll help you figure it out. But one of the things we can do is connect to that subscriber and start to take the messages off the bus. So we'll make a connection to your, to your MQTT broker. We will become a subscriber that will start pulling messages off the bus depending on what the topics are. And so this is a really powerful tool for people who have, like, let's say like a factory. So some of the customers I've worked with bringing this to market were facilities that process things, and they have at every step of the way, when an item comes through a station, that item may have an RFID in it. That item may have a barcode that needs to be scanned. Or it has to be handled in a certain way. And this is allowing those devices to collect all that information and then put that data into Domo in a very low, in a way that's very conducive for networks that may have a high degree of latency and a low degree of bandwidth, because that's kind of the vision behind this protocol.
Andy, so, I know we have a couple of customers here who are interested in or exploring kind of low latency data flows. And I guess, do you have any things that they should be keeping in mind in terms of, like, you already mentioned adrenaline data flows as a way to reduce or aggregate the data. If we're thinking about, what is Domo good at out of the box without a really large platform fee or like negotiation around it? Like, what kind of expectations should people have? Can you kind of speak to that in terms of like refresh rates, row volume, where we tend to see more success or less frustration?
Well, in terms of the data flow part, I might turn that over to Nihar, because I'm not really over that part of the product, and so I don't want to necessarily speak for that team directly. But what I would say is so this MQTT will work similar. So I was talking about the network aspect of it. The total message volume, this will work very similar to a webhook, right? And in the sense that what we will do is similar to webhook, we will batch this up in 15-minute chunks and bring it in, all the messages that come on. But now you are right that this will be prone to some of the same things that webhook will be prone to where you would likely benefit from having adrenaline data flows as a data reduction or an aggregation tool to bring these metrics in. And so I would approach this the same way I would for a webhook. However, I will say, that's why I often engage with customers on not MQTT, but IoT in general, because I have found that we can be immensely successful in helping people get data they could never get before. It's absolutely the case, and I've seen them try it multiple ways. But the thing that's fascinating when I engage on one of these discussions that I think is a lot different is I'm having a discussion about, like, we have all these tools, right? So we have Webhook, we have MQTT, we have connectors to various IoT providers, things through Amazon, things through Azure. But at the end of the day, it's just using the right tools in the right fashion. So it could be completely appropriate based on what someone's trying to do to simply, instead of having the connector append the data or have the connector upsert the data or partition it to basically, at the end of the day, it may make sense just to do a every 15-minute replace, but I don't know based on what the customer's trying to accomplish, because that could be absolutely appropriate or a terrible idea based on what's trying to happen. And so this is something where I could spend an hour phone call just kind of asking questions and just finding out, what people have been trying to accomplish, what have they tried in the past, how have they failed. Because the thing that I will proudly say, and it's not just because I'm a proud Domo employee, but I haven't found a customer where we couldn't deliver ultimately what they wanted after we discussed the platform, the technologies, and how we'd approach it. But sometimes too, people may have a time series database, right? And it may just be appropriate to take Workbench with an ODBC connection and figure that out, right? And so you want to kind of go through and understand what infrastructure has been applied. And so I'm always mindful of that anytime I talk IoT, because it's not an answer. It's not a question of if, it's a question of how to me.
Wicked, thank you.
Okay. All right. So the last one, and I believe that Lacey from my team will be doing an hour-long session on this at the end of the week. So super excited for anyone to join that. So custom connectors. So this is something that we've had now for over four years. This is, if anyone's wondering, this is my pet project. I wanted to, I really, really wanted to make this happen 4 or 5 years ago, whenever it was. And I could not have dreamed of how, the success that this thing has had, just in terms of how many customers have used this, how many connectors customers have published. It's a fantastic tool. And so this is our full code tool for writing server-side JavaScript. It was funny, just the other day, I have a training that we can do. And so I did a 2-hour training with a customer on how to develop using this tool. But it's come a long way from its inception. There was a lot that, there wasn't a lot it did in its first version. It was very bare bones, and we've continued to just pile on feature after feature. But this is where you can write some very basic server-side JavaScript. This is where, we've taken all the knowledge that we built on connectors and how we parse things and how we flatten things, and provide some amazing convenience methods for which we refer to as our magic parse methods. So for example, if you have an XML file, and if anyone's ever tried to parse an XML file in JavaScript, I feel bad for you, because that was a horrible day. And so we provided some of these methods, for example, where we'll give you the magic parse method, or we'll give you a method that'll convert XML to JSON, so you can work on it easier with JavaScript code. But there's just a variety of awesome things you can do. And we've just had literally, I think at this point we're 1,000+ connectors that customers have written for themselves. And that's pretty awesome to think that that customers are rivaling what we've tried to build internally for Domo. So that's the custom connector IDE. I imagine most people are familiar with Writeback.
Wait, before we move on from custom connector,
Yes.
Mikkel asks a question. They said they've developed some custom connectors, and they're wondering how they can make it available to the larger Domo ecosystem. Is there a way of publishing it like you do a custom app?
Correct. And so two aspects of this. And so there's some gradations on that. And by the way, thanks for stopping me, Jay. Get rolling here. So there's a few aspects of this. The first aspect of this is when you submit the connector, there are the 2 modalities. The first modality is private only for your company. The second modality is public for all of Domo to use. What I find is then there's sort of a secondary modality where it's like, no, I don't want to give it to everyone, but I do want to give it to people that I have interacted with. Oftentimes, this will be a partner that has developed a solution that wants to use it. So you can actually publish it privately, and then you can actually reach out to the developer support team. So we have third-party connector support at domo.com. That is different than the regular support desk in the sense that that desk is specifically tasked or staffed by engineers and tasked with the purpose of providing code level support for this. So in other words, you call up and you're trying to fight with the tooling, you have a question about what method to use, why isn't this working, but it's really a code level question. And so we have engineers that staff that desk and provide you feedback. And so what you can do is you can also interact with that desk and say, I'd like to enable this for a second customer. I don't want to give it to everyone, but that is something that they can do. Now, the last part of this is we are looking at roadmap this year to where we'll look at more of a model where you could create a connector and you could open source it, so it became something that you could contribute and other people could use. And so that's something that's we're trying to work on this year. I don't want to sell any futures or promise anything isn't coming, but it's something that we're looking at because I think it'd be immensely powerful for someone to say, I want to write the initial connector, but I don't want to support it by myself, and be able to share that. So that's a consideration for the coming product year. And so I think maybe it gets to the heart of that question.
Wicked. Bag of worms, this topic, dude. Bag of worms. So you mentioned that there's a third-party support desk. And my concern is if you give this audience an inch, they'll take a mile. So can you just really quickly, high level, be very specific? When do I hit support with a connector question versus when do I talk to third-party support? And like, who says no?
Well, by the way, if you do email third-party connector support for a regular connector issue, you will be redirected to support@domo.com. The only time that this comes into play is specifically for third-party connector development questions, right? So in support of deploying your connector, in support of building and maintaining your connector. So if you say, hey, I'm not terribly happy with the XYZ connector, great, we want to help you, but we need to get you into support@domo.com. This is meant to be a tool for people who are engineering and building connectors to get kind of code level support from another engineer.
Is it specifically custom connectors, or does it also extend to, for example, the webhook connector you were describing earlier?
The webhook would go through traditional support. So if you did not build it in the connector IDE, then it is not supported through that channel.
Okay. And then here's a question that, I mean, I felt the pain. I think we've all felt it a little bit in some form or another. Mark is asking if there's a process for deprecating connectors that are either outdated or the functionality is no longer working as expected. What does that look like?
Yeah, so it's is that related to connectors in general, or is that related to the custom connectors, just to be clear?
We're talking about connector in general. So the NOAA connector, for example, wasn't working as expected. Yeah,
so it is a difficult thing at times with this, keeping in mind that unfortunately, as hard as we try, and we try exceptionally hard, we can occasionally get blindsided with API changes. We do work really hard to avoid that, but it is an unfortunate situation that can occasionally come up. So generally speaking, the ideal scenario that we do follow is we are following the ISVs that provide the APIs to our connectors, and we are trying to monitor that, and we are trying to become aware of changes. And so when we become aware of an API revision, the initial thing that goes into motion is we begin the process of developing or modifying the existing connector internally to find out what changed. So example, in the case where we got a new API, we're going to go in there and we're going to do a comparison. Now, the hard part is where do we go from there? Because there are a couple different ways that this potentially can happen. It may just be that everything that was prior just needs to call can call the same endpoint or a new endpoint and derive the same data with the same, when you do the analysis, the metrics and dimensions will pan out. So if that's the case, then hopefully we can just add what's new, so you get new features in the connector, and we will essentially update the other stuff to keep continuity of service going. However, sometimes and all too often we find the new API is now going to introduce a breaking change. So now we have one of two choices, which is we will effectively create a new connector. So you'll essentially have connector V1, right? And then you'll see us produce connector V2. And what connector V2 will do is, so there isn't a migration path between the two of them, right? Because at the end of the day, if I cut you over to that new connector, that is going to cause you problems with your data. It's not functionally equivalent. So that's when we get into a play where we'll leave the old connector there, as long as it will possibly work to allow people to have continuity of service. But you'll start to see us prompting you to say, and you'll get, we send out messaging through our, our customer success managers, our account teams, any way we can. But what you'll start to see is us encouraging you to move to the latest version of that connector. And so that you can start to move your content over so that you don't end up in a scenario where there's an outage. Now, in the cases where we just, for whatever reason, it was an abrupt change. Usually this is with ISVs that have much shorter development cycles and don't have to kind of conform to a cycle of attrition for their APIs. Then obviously we monitor, and we monitor extensively, and we look at every unexpected error that connectors put out and determine if it's something that we need to take action on. And so as soon as we see that, we'll immediately jump in action. We'll start to work. We'll apply the two concepts before, which is to say we'll either try and just make it work under the existing connector, or we'll make it work by providing a new one. And then there is sort of a nuance where occasionally we will find, and this is my least favorite scenario, where the new API does provide the same data, however, they have renamed things. So we'll do our best to, if we know it's a functional equivalent, it's just a simple rename. What's disconcerting though is we'll either add a new column if it's not functional equivalent, because I can't count on that won't cause problems with your data. But otherwise, we'll go ahead and enable it. So if you were expecting it to come in as value, column name A, that we will accept that as an input parameter, but we will deliver it. We'll essentially map that to what is the new column, and then we'll go ahead and remap it back out in your data grid as the original, so it doesn't break your downstream data pipeline items. But that's kind of how it works. I do know, I hear the pain in that question. I do understand it. And yeah, it's a hard thing because I can't get the same level of partnership that I do with everyone that I connect to.
Sure.
So sometimes I'm reactionary versus proactive, but I just want to be clear, it's a commitment on our part. We update connectors every week, and we do that intentionally and purposefully to provide the best experience we can. And I'm hoping, as we see more and more adoption with a lot of our connectors, that it gives me a bigger banner to wave to some of these ISVs to say, would you partner with me? Because if I can get that level of partnership, that's also where I'm going to be delivering, I think, a better experience for mutual customers.
One last question about this before we move on to some of the other stuff you have. And also I'm conscious of the fact that we're reaching what was the scheduled end of this conference. One of the things you mentioned was that if there is a change in the connector, you'll release a V2. And you and I were working on a customer a couple of years ago where you were implementing a change in the connector that would support partitioning, I think it was. And I can't recall if we did like a cutover where we moved them over to that new connector to take advantage of that feature, or for everyone else, if they would have to recreate the connectors by hand. So like when you add new functionality, like on the Domo side, API doesn't change, but for example, we implement upsert or partitioning, do I then have to create a new connector, or does it automatically update?
Yeah, so there's a lot of thought, and unfortunate, and maybe it can seem unfortunate, but there's nuance. It will depend on the system. So we do provide a large amount of partition supported connectors, and we're continuing to add that. Every single database connector at this point should have partition support, but we do have it as a separate connector.
Okay.
Ultimately, what you're going to see here is that we'll start to roll that partition feature potentially back into the original connectors. Now, what happens is every once in a while, someone will come in and say, look, I need to be on partition support yesterday. I have a lot of data sets. I cannot move this manually. And so then we can look at moving that customer. It would just be something where that customer needs to reach out through Domo support or their CSM or AE, and we can look at helping them with that type of operation. I mean, we try to be as helpful as we can every time. But it just depends on the circumstances, because a lot of what we're trying to do is couch against getting you in a situation where we've given you an unforced change, right? Like we want you, because if there's a case where the underlying systems are not going to allow this change to just be smooth, meaning that there's work that has to be done, we're not just going to make that decision for you. We're gonna enable you to make that decision, that timing, that kind of stuff for yourself.
Okay. Okay. Awesome.
All right. Well, if we are at the end, I'm happy just to do arbitrary. I'll just kind of tease the other topics. I prepared a lot of material, just depending on what people were interested in. So we talked a bit about write back. So I think everyone's aware of that. I just wanted to call out, similar to the JSON no code, if you're looking to build a custom way to get data out of Domo, we have the ability to post a JSON payload to an endpoint. And so this is an evolving thing, but this is kind of a cool no code solution for build your own write back without having to build your own write back, although we do support that. We talked a little bit about it, partition support. We have a bunch of connectors.
Wait, sorry, the write back, is that paid or unpaid or free?
That is part of write back, so you would have to be enabled with write back, so it's part of Integration Cloud. So it is a paid connector.
Premium feature.
Premium feature, yes.
Okay.
Yep, and so we talked about that. I just always like to call out, so we did some cool work recently. We created an S3 partition support connector. So because we had some customers that could really benefit from that. So I just call to your attention. That exists now. I call this one out because I run into people who have some kind of crazy S3 buckets occasionally, and Athena is amazing. And so if you can utilize this Amazon service and use that to query the data out, fantastic. The other thing that we have starting to roll out now is non-date-based partitions for connectors. So if you notice, most of the connectors right now, they only support date-based. This is rolling out. The first connector to get this is Snowflake, and you'll see this coming to more connectors where you'll have non-date-based. So look forward to that. And then I just want to call out for coders that wanted a simpler data API. We released this 2 Domopaloozas ago. And this is a pretty awesome API that a lot of people have found, but maybe not everyone's aware of. So if you're not wanting to, this will manage smaller data sets for sure. If you are doing massive data sets, you'll want to keep using the Streams API. But this is a really great way. We made this for people who just wanted to get data in with some simple JSON API. So that's what we created. And then SFTP push, it's a great Swiss Army knife for pushing data in. So this is where we provide an SFTP service that you can push the data into Domo. And then the last one I was just going to mention is we do provide these. So these are our unload connectors. So when you're working with pulling in large data sets I highlighted Snowflake and BigQuery. We also have this for Redshift, where these systems support unloading into an S3 bucket in parallel, and then we can read the data in parallel, and so we support that. And this is a pretty awesome feature. I always like to tout that I did terabytes of data with a customer, and I can't name the customer. I don't want to name all the specifics, but it was pretty awesome because we slammed in terabytes of data, and I thought, wow, this is pretty awesome tech.
Wow.
All right, so we're at the end. I think Jay kept me honest along the way and made me answer any questions, but I'm at time. However, I'm willing to take any questions. I believe I should have done it at the end slide too, but I'll just put my email. Jay can share it with the group, and we're happy to help.
Yeah, Andy, what we'll do is I'll send a survey out at the end of this call and collect questions from people, and we'll try to answer as many as we can so that we don't overload you, but we'll pass on the salient ones up your way.
Well, it was a pleasure. Thank you for giving me your time to talk about all my favorite things.
Oh my God, dude, this has been amazing. And like, I'm not kidding. I want to do a YouTube video on each of these topics because I think you're right. There are so many, and you didn't want to call them hidden gems, but they just are hidden gems because we don't know about them. And so like, I'm as passionate well, maybe not as passionate as you are, but I'll try to be as passionate as you are about helping educate the community because this is just so cool, man. So thank you for that. Okay, so this is the end of the conference, guys. We have another, is today only Tuesday? Please tell me today's not only Tuesday. I don't know if I can get through this week. We have another couple days of conference material lined up for you. We've got data science focus track tomorrow. The day after, we're going to focus on automation. And then the third day is going to be hardcore scripting. Andy already hinted, we've got one of his folks coming in to help us build a connector. We're going to build some custom apps. So there's a very rich and deep lineup of stuff that we're going to be doing. My dear panelists, you guys are welcome to drop off if you like. If anybody else has any questions, I'll try to answer them now, or as I said, if you've been putting them into Slack, you guys have all been putting them into chat, you're killing me. You've been putting them into Slack, I promise I'll get to you. If you've been putting them into Zoom chat, I'll try. We'll get these videos posted. I am going to try to start posting these videos before the end of the week, but it's a long day getting this conference together, so we'll see. All right, let's go through the questions. Hold on. Justice asks a connector, very connector specific question. I think Andy already said it. You know, the best way to start there is to start with support@domo.com. Mikkel asks if the simple data API is premium. No, as far as I know, none of the APIs are premium. I'm pretty like either you have it or you don't. What Domo and Domo folks, if I'm misstating, you know, please correct me. What Domo will do is like for the UI, you might have to pay, but for the for write back, right? If you wanted to create a connector that queries APIs or create a process that queries APIs, you can do that. And that's like a surrogate or a proxy for the write back UI or the write back experience. But that's not, the access to the API is not gated or premium, a premium feature. Milan asks if custom webhooks are on the roadmap. That one we're gonna have to go back to Andy on, but I think Andy had said that you can build webhook-based connectors in the IDE, but I'll follow up with him. Have I hit all the questions? Oh, there's a Q&A. Hold on. Somebody asks. Oh no, we covered those. Anonymous asks about upsert and webhooks, or upsert. I'm sure somebody wants to know about upsert and connectors. Again, that's something that I don't know the answer to, but I'm definitely going to ask Lacey when she joins us on Friday, and or email Andy.